Today's reading is from Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 to chapter 2, verse 1, and Revelation chapter 21, verses 1 to 5. Then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground." Then God said, "I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food. And to all the beasts of the earth, and all the birds in the sky, and all the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has the breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food." And it was so. God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. Now we'll move on to Revelation. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away." He who was seated on the throne said, "I am making everything new." Then he said, "Write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true." This is the word of the Lord.
Thank you so much, Karen, for those readings from the Bible. Good morning, everyone. So pleased to be speaking to you today. So in November, Glasgow is set to host COP26, the 26th United Nations Climate Change Conference. And the archbishops of the Church of England are encouraging Christians to pray about and to engage thoughtfully and theologically in the issues that conference will be looking at. Issues of sustainability, biodiversity, carbon emissions, the future of the planet, and the impact for future generations. Today, Sir David Attenborough is going to be addressing the G7 leaders in Cornwall, and he has said in advance that in the next decade, we face some of the most important decisions in human history. Prince Charles has already urged those same G7 leaders to be as focused in their leadership on decisions relating to the planet as they have been recently on their decisions in relation to the pandemic. Concerns about creation care are all around us. And in this three-part series on creation care, we're trying to look at the biblical, theological framework out of which we can engage well with this massive contemporary topic. And really this morning there are two things I want to say, and the first thing and the main thing is this. The biblical story is one of God's commitment to making all things new. The biblical story is one of God's commitment to making all things new. So as we heard a moment ago in our readings, The story the Bible tells begins with a perfect garden in Genesis, which human beings are given responsibility to steward, to help it to flourish and achieve its potential. But the biblical story ends with a perfected garden city. This is the vision of Revelation, with the Lord declaring, "Look, I'm making all things new." It's Revelation 21 and verse 5. But I have to say for myself that I've not always understood the biblical story about the future in that way. Here's a little bit of my journey with this. So when I was 13 years old, which is a very long time ago now, I went to a Scripture Union camp one summer, and that was where I first consciously decided to become a follower of Jesus. Because I heard talks and testimonies that moved me deeply about God's desire for me to know him, about my shortcomings and failings, my sins, being a barrier to knowing God in that way. God having himself dealt with that barrier by coming to earth in the person of Jesus, dying a sacrificial death for me before being raised to new life on the third day. And God inviting me to respond to what Jesus did for me by turning away from going my own way in life and instead turning to Jesus. Receiving all the benefits of what he had done for me, receiving his forgiveness and committing myself to following him with my life and following his ways. And that's what I did. That's the decision that I made as a 13-year-old. And I would still say today, it's the best decision that I have ever made. And I still think today that it's the single most important decision that any person can make about how to live their life. But if you'd asked me back then or in the years afterwards what following Jesus meant for me, my future, and the future of the world, I would probably have, I think, said something like this. Well, wonderfully, I know that I'm forgiven by Jesus, so my future beyond this life will be eternal life with God in heaven. And as for the future of the world, I might have said something like, look, it's great if we can do some positive good while we live on the earth, almost like a sort of optional extra, if you like. But ultimately, we'll leave this world to go and be with God in heaven. So I want to make sure that I don't let the world sort of drag me down or drag me away from God. And perhaps the most important thing is to help other people know that they too can have a future with God in heaven if they turn to Jesus now. Well, today, I see it a bit differently from that, although there is much wonderful truth in what I understood as a 13-year-old. What happened to me was that in my 20s, I heard a series of talks by a man called Mike Lloyd, who's now the principal of Wycliffe Hall Theological College in Oxford. Those talks later became part of a book that he wrote. This book here, which I'm always very happy to recommend, I think it's a great book, called Cafe Theology. And that began to change my views a bit, and then I began to study theology myself at Wycliffe Hall in Oxford and as I prepared for ordination. And what I began to realize was this. The story that the Bible tells about God, the world, and us isn't a story about the material world being a hindrance to a spiritual life with God, and that one day we'll be free of that hindrance as we exit the material world to be with God in heaven. That's actually more of a Greek, dualistic idea of the spiritual being superior to the material. The biblical story actually is this. God creates everything that exists, including our planet, out of the overflow of his love. Yes, that creation becomes dislocated and disjointed. It's spoiled and it's marred because sin and evil and its effects are real. But in his love, God commits to the task of putting things to rights, making all things new. Not chucking it away and being done with it, or ultimately taking his people out from it, but renewing creation, recycling it, we might say. And a decisive moment, a victorious moment in God's work of new creation is the coming of Jesus. Through his life, his death, his resurrection from the dead, the world is indeed set on a new course, a new trajectory towards ultimately the renewal of all things. Now, again, to be clear, that process of renewal does and will include the rooting out of the effects of sin and evil. So this biblical story does involve judgment and destruction, as well as healing and redemption. And wonderfully, part of this work of new creation that God is doing is individuals being invited into a renewed relationship with God through Jesus. Through those ways that I first heard about as a 13-year-old, turning away from going my own way in life and instead turning to Christ. But that renewed relationship isn't, as it were, simply a way to book our ticket for one day going to be with God in heaven. Rather, it's a relationship with God in which God enrolls us to play our part in his plan to make all things new, which actually we can do in a whole variety of different creative ways. In other words, let me sum it up like this. The ultimate future that the Bible shows us isn't God taking his people out of the world to go up to live with him in heaven, though there is an intermediate stage when those who die in Christ go to be with him. But the ultimate future the Bible speaks about is God coming down here, bringing the garden city of God, establishing the reunification of heaven and earth as his dwelling place forever. It's a beautiful, powerful, hope-filled vision. It's what we read about in Revelation 21, verses 3 and 4 a moment ago. Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and will be their God. He himself will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. Now, the thing is, that kind of hope, vision for the future, I think we'd acknowledge, is very hard to imagine or to try to comprehend in practice. But what I want to say this morning is that that doesn't mean that we won't one day experience it. There's a character in a novel, an elderly pastor in Marilyn Robinson's novel Gilead, who I think really helpfully puts it like this. In the novel, this elderly pastor says, "This morning I've been trying to think about that future world, the new heaven and the new earth, but without much success. But I could never have imagined this world if I hadn't spent almost 8 decades walking around in it." Now, I find the logic of that quote really helpful. We've all experienced the reality of this world, though we could never have imagined it before. So struggling to imagine the new heaven and the new earth doesn't mean that we won't one day experience it in all its currently unimaginable beauty, glory, and harmony. We will. So, the biblical story of the future is one of God's commitment to making all things new. That's the first and the main thing that I want to say this morning. But the second thing that I think follows is this: that future starts now. That future starts now. In other words, caring for creation in godly ways anticipates that future that we'll one day experience. Caring for creation now, today, isn't just fulfilling the commission that God gave to human beings at the start of the Bible in Genesis. It is that, but as well as that, it's also prophetically anticipating and moving us towards that future that there will one day be, a new heaven and a new earth, the renewal of all things. That's why, one of the reasons why creation care now is so important. Let me try and illustrate it this way. I remember many years ago now, before the final books in the Harry Potter series were released, I remember it being reported that the final ending of the final book had already been written by the author, J.K. Rowling, but was locked away really securely. I think it was reported it was tucked away in a big safe somewhere, so that no one could know in advance how the story, the series of stories, was finally going to end. It was a big deal to keep it a secret. No spoilers. Well, I want to suggest that the biblical story works exactly the other way around to that. We're shown the future that we're headed towards precisely so that we can begin to anticipate that future now in how we live. Ways that align now with that future that we're headed towards. Well, you might be wondering how. Well, how do we do that then? What does that mean in practice? What does creation care look like today? Well, as Rachel said last week, it's not really our intention in this series to try and prescribe specifically what any of us should or shouldn't be doing in terms of care for creation, because there are many different parts that we can play, and there's no aspect of caring for creation that is too small to be of significance. But more our aim is to inspire us all, if we aren't doing this already, to be engaged in this as an issue and to be learning more about it, and both for ourselves and perhaps in conversation with others, encouraging and maybe even challenging one another with how we can play our part in this. What I would love to encourage you to do is to head to our website, where we've put together a bunch of resources around creation care that are particularly designed to do just that, to help us to, each of us, inform ourselves a little bit more, and perhaps to equip us for conversations and debates and discussions about this with others. But let me give you, if I may, one small, recent little example of how actually we can do this, how these kinds of conversations can encourage us in very practical ways that might lead us to taking incremental steps that make a difference. So, on Friday night of the week just gone, Emma and I watched the Netflix documentary Seaspiracy, which is actually an alarming and provocative film about the commercialization of overfishing and its effects on the planet. Actually, I found it really interesting because I hadn't really thought very much, in thinking about climate issues, about the seas, the oceans, sustainability, and effects of overfishing on marine life. But the reason that we watched it was because of a recommendation from a friend here at St. Stephen's, who talked very passionately about the impact that watching that film had had on him, and some of the things he'd begun to think about differently and to do differently as a result. It's a little example of just that conversation amongst us as a community, spurring us on in our understanding and in our practice. I should say that slightly ironically and really quite unfortunately when you think about it, well, Emma and I had decided to watch this film whilst having our supper together on Friday night, and without really thinking about it, had made ourselves fish cakes while we were watching it. So whilst I might recommend watching Seaspiracy as a provocative and alarming kind of documentary, probably fish cakes is not the thing to make and to eat while you try to watch it. Let me conclude what I'm saying this morning by saying this. So at our 9 o'clock in-person service earlier this morning, we shared the sacrament of Holy Communion together, where we believe that God meets with us, connects with us through the material gifts of bread and wine. And so as we took communion earlier this morning, I encouraged the congregation, as they were receiving communion, to ponder this remarkable Christian hope that the Bible gives us, that one day all things will be filled with God's presence. Mike Lloyd, in that book I mentioned, Cafe Theology, writes about it like this: in the new heaven and the new earth, every particle will be a sacrament, shot through with God's Spirit and pregnant with the possibility of relationship with our Maker. I'm going to finish now with a short video that Rachel filmed last week with Sarah Goff, who's one of our church wardens and a very keen gardener. It was filmed at Hampton Court Palace. And in this interview, Sarah speaks in almost sacramental terms about how, for her, gardening and caring for God's creation connects her to the God who in Jesus Christ is Lord of the earth.
Well, hi, Sarah. Thanks so much for being with me today. Can you just tell us, where are you?
Hi, Rachel. So I'm here, as you can probably see, at Hampton Court Palace. I volunteer here in the gardens 1 day a week, which is fabulous for my sanity.
Fantastic. It looks like a beautiful day. What a great place to be.
It is fantastic.
Now, Sarah, I know that you're an avid gardener, and I just wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how your kind of appreciation of nature, gardening, links to your faith.
Yeah, to me, I think, there's such amazing variety and creativity and beauty in the natural world and in gardening in particular. That's all testament to me of God's sort of majesty and care for creation. And even something as simple as leaves, we think they're green, but actually if you look at them, some are long and thin, some are short, some are round, some are hairy, some are almost blue, some are reddish. There's such an amazing variety. And of course, photosynthesis, which is what leaves do, every life on earth is dependent on photosynthesis. Plants are the only thing that can actually make their own food, and it's an incredibly complex process. I mean, it's actually so complex that if you're in an arid country, plants do part 1 in the day and part 2 at night, and it just sort of blows my mind that sort of thing, it's a sign of God's creativity, and I really struggle with people who think that's all just happened by chance.
Fantastic. So this idea that through your engagement with nature and creation, it's really pointing you to the creator, as it were.
Yeah. Definitely.
And in this series, we're looking a little bit at issues of the, environment and sustainability. And I just wonder if, as a gardener, you could share with us, how is your approach to gardening kind of informed by your reading of the Bible?
Yes, I think I very much see that we are called to work and care for the earth, and that doesn't mean control it. And I think we as a culture, particularly in the urban culture, we do tend to try to control things. And particularly in the last 50 years, I guess, we have sort of sprayed insects and, used fertilizers and that kind of thing. But actually, if gardening reminds us that we're not in control. Actually, it's God's world. He's in control. You can never finish gardening. You can finish today, come back tomorrow, and something's grown or something's been eaten. So it really is helpful in terms of keeping our perspective that Jesus is Lord of the earth and we're not. I just want to say one other thing, two other things actually. One is that, we all know biodiversity is a problem, but even in our small gardens in Twickenham area, we can actually do a lot. If you choose plants that have got food sources, whether that's for bees or birds, don't choose plants that they can't get at the food. And that it makes a big difference. We can actually really help that even in our own little areas. And there's masses of gardens around here you can volunteer in. So whether it's National Trust or Chiswick House or Ham House or here, there's lots and lots of places to get outside and enjoy God's creation.
With that thought, I'll let you crack on. Oh, thanks so much for your time. That's brilliant, Sarah.
Thank you.
Happy gardening.